They thought it would be funny to hand her a gun and watch her fail. But what happened next would leave that entire shooting range questioning everything they thought they knew about skill, judgment, and respect. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall glass panels of Iron Ridge Shooting Club, casting long golden streaks across polished concrete floors as the sharp scent of gun oil and metal hung quietly in the air, a place where confidence walked in loud and mistakes were remembered longer than they should be. Inside lane number 7, a group of seasoned shooters stood in relaxed formation, their tailored range gear, custom holsters, and effortless posture making it clear they weren't beginners. They spoke in low tones, trading stories of precision and near-perfect scores, the kind of men who believed skill was something you could see from across the room, something measured in stance, attire, and the quiet arrogance that came with years of experience. And then the door opened, barely noticeable at first, a soft creak swallowed by the echo of distant shots, and she stepped in, Emily Carter, dressed in a simple gray hoodie, worn jeans, and sneakers that had clearly seen better days. Her presence didn't command attention. It slipped into the room like a whisper, unnoticed by most, dismissed by the rest. She moved calmly toward the sign-in counter, her eyes steady, observant, taking in the layout, the distances marked in yards, the rhythm of the room, the subtle hierarchy that existed without anyone needing to say it out loud. Behind her, one of the shooters glanced over, his lips curling slightly as he nudged the man beside him, a quiet signal that something amusing had just entered their space. "We've got a first-timer," he muttered under his breath, not loud enough to start a scene, but just enough for the group to hear. A ripple of quiet amusement passed between them. Another shooter leaned back slightly, folding his arms, watching her with the casual interest of someone expecting entertainment, not competition. Emily didn't react, didn't look over, didn't acknowledge the shift in energy behind her. She simply signed her name, her handwriting neat, controlled, almost deliberate, then stepped toward an open lane, lane number 9, as if she had been there before, as if the room wasn't filled with eyes measuring her worth before she had even touched a single piece of equipment. The men continued watching, their confidence untouched, their assumptions unchallenged, because in their world, people like her didn't belong in places like this, not with that outfit, not with that quiet demeanor, not with that absence of visible experience. And yet there was something almost imperceptible in the way she moved, the way her shoulders stayed relaxed but aligned, the way her gaze didn't wander but fixed itself briefly on each target, as if calculating something deeper than distance. One of the shooters frowned slightly, just for a moment, before dismissing the thought entirely, because sometimes the biggest mistake isn't underestimating someone. It's being so certain that you're right. You never even consider the possibility that you're wrong. And at that moment, none of them had any idea that the quiet woman they had already decided to laugh at was about to change the atmosphere of that entire range without raising her voice, without asking for attention, and without missing a single shot. The low murmur behind her grew just loud enough to carry meaning, not loud enough to be called out, the kind of commentary designed to sting without consequence. One of the men stepped closer to the divider between lanes, resting his arm casually against the polished surface as he watched Emily begin to set up. "You know there is a beginner class on Saturdays," he said with a faint smile that did not reach his eyes. A few others chuckled softly. Another voice followed, lighter, almost playful. "Might want to start with something smaller before jumping into this lane." The words floated through the air like harmless advice, but the tone told a different story. Emily did not turn around. She did not defend herself. She did not even acknowledge that she had heard them. Instead, she opened the case in front of her with slow, deliberate movements, revealing a standard range pistol, nothing flashy, nothing customized, just clean, well-maintained, and handled with a level of care that suggested familiarity rather than uncertainty. One of the shooters raised an eyebrow, noticing the way she checked the chamber, the way her fingers moved without hesitation, precise but unhurried. It was subtle, easy to miss if you were not paying attention, but something about it did not match the image they had already built in their minds. Probably watched a few videos, another man muttered, dismissing the thought before it could take root, because assumptions are easier to maintain than questions. Emily adjusted her stance, feet shoulder-width apart, weight balanced, her posture aligning naturally, as if her body remembered something long practiced. The fluorescent lights above cast a soft reflection along the metal surfaces around her, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to slow. The distant sounds of other lanes faded into the background, replaced by a quiet focus that settled over her like a second skin. Behind her, one of the younger shooters tilted his head slightly, studying her more carefully now. There was no nervous shifting, no hesitation, no unnecessary movement, just stillness, controlled and intentional. She is taking this a little too seriously, someone whispered, but there was a hint of uncertainty creeping into the words, as if the joke was beginning to lose its certainty. The man who had first spoken stepped forward again, this time placing a box of higher caliber rounds on the counter beside her lane, the kind typically used by more experienced shooters. If you are going to try, you might as well do it right, he said, the challenge now clearer, more direct, an invitation wrapped in condescension. A few phones were raised discreetly, capturing the moment, expecting a mistake, a flinch, something that would confirm their expectations. Emily glanced at the box for just a fraction of a second, then back at the target set at 25 yards, her expression unchanged, calm, almost distant, as if the voices around her no longer existed. She loaded the magazine smoothly, each motion clean and efficient, then brought the firearm up, her arms steady, her breathing even. There was a brief pause, not of uncertainty, but of calculation, a silence that stretched just long enough to make the observers shift slightly where they stood. The room did not go completely quiet, but something in the atmosphere tightened, like the air before a storm. One of the men lowered his phone slightly, his earlier confidence flickering for just a moment, because sometimes it is not the loud moments that change everything. It is the quiet ones, the ones where nothing obvious happens, but something unseen begins to shift. And as Emily aligned her sight with the center of the target, her finger resting gently, patiently, on the trigger, the same thought crossed more than one mind in that room, though none of them said it out loud. What if they had misjudged her? What if the story they were about to witness was not the one they had expected? And in that suspended second, just before anything irreversible could happen, the weight of that possibility settled over the range like a shadow. They could not yet understand. The moment stretched just a fraction longer than anyone expected, the kind of silence that does not feel empty but charged, like something unseen is about to break through. Emily's finger rested with quiet certainty, not tense, not hesitant, just ready. And then she exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that seemed to pull the entire room into stillness with her. The shot rang out sharp and clean, echoing across the concrete walls, not loud in chaos but precise, like a single note struck perfectly on cue. Every head turned toward the target almost instantly, the movement synchronized as if pulled by the same invisible thread. For a split second no one spoke, no one reacted, because what they saw did not immediately register. The round had landed exactly at center, not slightly off, not close enough to argue about, but perfectly aligned. A level of precision that demanded a second look. One of the shooters blinked, stepping forward instinctively, narrowing his eyes as if distance had distorted his vision. That was lucky, someone said quickly, the words coming out faster than thought. Eager to restore balance to a situation that had already begun to tilt, a few nervous chuckles followed. Thinner this time, lacking the confidence from before, Emily did not turn around. She did not smile. She did not acknowledge the result. She simply adjusted her stance again, calm, composed, as if the outcome had been expected, as if there had never been another possibility. Behind her, one of the younger men lowered his phone completely now, no longer filming for amusement, but watching with a growing sense of uncertainty, because luck does not look like that. Luck does not move with that kind of control. Do it again, the first man said, his voice firmer now, not mocking but testing. He slid another magazine closer to her lane, this time without the smirk, without the casual arrogance, just a quiet insistence. Emily reached for it without hesitation, her movements identical to before, consistent in a way that began to feel deliberate, almost methodical. She loaded, raised the firearm, aligned her sight. The room tightened again, but this time it was different. The earlier amusement replaced by anticipation. No one laughed, no one whispered. Even the distant sounds from other lanes seemed to fade, as if the space itself was holding its breath. Another controlled inhale, another steady exhale. The second shot followed, just as clean, just as precise. The sound cutting through the silence and leaving something heavier behind. Eyes snapped back to the target, and again. The result was undeniable. Center, perfect. No deviation, no argument. Just accuracy that spoke louder than any explanation could. The silence this time was deeper, heavier, pressing down on every assumption that had filled the room minutes earlier. One of the shooters stepped closer now, his earlier confidence gone, replaced by something closer to disbelief. He leaned slightly, as if proximity would change what he was seeing, but it did not. The target remained unchanged in its message. Precision, consistency, control. Emily lowered the firearm slowly, her posture unchanged, her expression unreadable. She was not performing, not proving, not reacting. She was simply doing, and that difference was beginning to unsettle everyone watching. Because skill that seeks attention behaves one way, but skill that exists without needing recognition behaves another. And what stood in front of them now was not someone trying to impress. It was someone who had nothing to prove. One of the men let out a quiet breath he did not realize he had been holding. "Who is she?" he murmured under his breath, but no one answered, because no one knew. And for the first time since she walked in, the question was no longer whether she belonged there, but how they had failed to see it from the very beginning. The silence did not break this time. It deepened, settling over the range like something heavy and undeniable, the kind of quiet that does not ask for attention but demands it. The men who had laughed only minutes ago now stood still, their earlier confidence slipping away piece by piece, replaced by something far less comfortable, uncertainty. One of them cleared his throat as if to reset the atmosphere, but no words followed, because nothing he could say would undo what they had just witnessed. Emily remained exactly where she was, her posture relaxed, her gaze steady on the target, as if she were simply finishing a routine task rather than dismantling every assumption in the room. The man who had first mocked her stepped forward again, but this time there was no smirk, no casual lean, just a careful, measured step as though he were approaching something he did not fully understand. "That was impressive," he said, the words sounding unfamiliar in his voice, like something he was not used to offering, especially not to someone he had already dismissed. Emily did not respond immediately. She adjusted the firearm with the same quiet precision, then set it down gently, her movements unhurried, controlled, as if time moved differently around her. Another shooter, older, more experienced, folded his arms as he studied her closely, his eyes narrowing not in judgment now, but in recognition, the kind that comes when something familiar begins to surface beneath the surface. "Where did you train?" he asked, his tone neutral. But the question carried weight. It was no longer about mockery. It was about understanding. Emily glanced at him briefly, her expression calm, almost detached. "Here and there," she said simply, the answer offering nothing and everything at the same time. A few of the men exchanged glances, unsatisfied, because people like her were not supposed to exist without explanation. Skill like that was supposed to come with a story, a reputation, something visible, something they could place. But she offered none of it, and that absence unsettled them more than any display ever could. The younger shooter who had been filming earlier stepped closer to the target, his steps slower now, deliberate, as if approaching evidence rather than a simple piece of paper. He reached out, touching the center point lightly, as though confirming it was real, that it had not somehow been altered. His hand dropped slowly, and he turned back toward the group, his expression no longer amused. "That is not luck," he said quietly, the words hanging in the air like a final verdict. No one argued, because there was nothing left to argue. Emily stepped back from the lane, removing her ear protection with a calm motion, the faint ambient noise of the range returning around her. But it felt different now, distant, as if the moment they had just witnessed existed slightly outside of everything else. The man who had offered the higher caliber rounds earlier looked down at the remaining box, then back at her. A flicker of something crossing his face, respect, or perhaps realization. One more, he said, but this time it was not a challenge. It was a request, quiet, almost careful, as if he understood that whatever happened next was not something he could control. Emily paused for a brief moment, her eyes shifting from the target to the line of men who now watched her in silence, not with judgment, not with amusement, but with attention, real attention, the kind that comes too late. And in that brief pause, something shifted again, not in the room, but in them, because they were no longer watching someone they thought they understood. They were watching someone they had already underestimated, and that realization had begun to settle in a way that could not be undone. Emily reached for the firearm once more, her movements unchanged, steady, familiar, as if the weight in her hands was something she had carried long before any of them had formed their opinions. And as she lifted it again, aligning her sight with quiet certainty, one thought passed silently through the room, unspoken but shared. They had not just been wrong about her. They had been completely blind to what was standing in front of them all along. And this time, no one laughed. The moment lingered as Emily lifted the firearm again. But this time it was not just about the shot. It was about everything that had already changed. The air itself felt different, heavier, as if the room had quietly shifted its allegiance, without anyone needing to say it out loud. The men who once stood with easy confidence now held themselves a little more carefully, their posture no longer relaxed but attentive, watching her not as entertainment, but as something they needed to understand. Emily's stance settled into place once more, feet grounded, shoulders aligned, her breathing steady in a rhythm that seemed untouched by the tension around her. She did not rush, did not perform. She simply prepared, and in that preparation there was a quiet authority that no one could ignore anymore. The man who had spoken last stepped slightly to the side, giving her a clearer line without realizing he was doing it, a small gesture that spoke louder than anything he had said before. No one laughed, no one whispered. Even the faint movements from nearby lanes seemed to fade into the background, because something in this moment demanded attention, real attention. Emily focused on the target again, but there was no strain in her gaze, no visible effort, just clarity, as if distance and difficulty had already been resolved in her mind long before the action itself. She exhaled slowly, and once again, the sound that followed cut cleanly through the space, controlled, precise, unmistakable. And when every eye snapped back to the target, the result did not surprise her, but it stunned everyone else. Perfect. Again, not slightly off, not close, but exact, a repetition that erased any lingering doubt. This was not chance. This was not a moment. This was consistency. And consistency is something you cannot fake. One of the shooters let out a quiet breath that sounded almost like disbelief. Another lowered his gaze briefly, shaking his head as if trying to reset what he thought he understood. The older man who had asked where she trained earlier stepped closer now, not to challenge, not to question, but to see for himself. His eyes traced the pattern on the target, then shifted back to her with a different expression entirely, something quieter, something closer to respect. Emily lowered the firearm and placed it gently on the counter, her movements unchanged, still calm, still controlled, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. And that was what unsettled them the most. Not just what she could do, but how little she needed anyone to recognize it. The man who had first mocked her looked at her now without a trace of humor, his voice lower, more careful. "You have done this before," he said, not as a question, but as a realization. Emily glanced at him briefly, her expression soft but unreadable. "A few times," she replied, and the simplicity of the answer carried more weight than any explanation ever could, because it confirmed what they were only beginning to understand. That skill like hers does not appear overnight. It is built in silence, refined without an audience, and revealed only when it has nothing left to prove. The younger shooter who had touched the target earlier stepped back slowly, his earlier curiosity now replaced with something more grounded, something closer to humility. The room remained quiet, not awkward, not tense, but reflective, as if everyone present was recalculating something within themselves. And in that quiet recalibration, the shift became complete. She was no longer the outsider, no longer the subject of their assumptions. She had become the standard they now measured themselves against, and none of them had seen it coming. Emily reached for her things, her movements signaling something even more unexpected than everything before. She was finished, not because she needed to be, but because she had already done enough. And as she stepped away from the lane, leaving behind nothing but a series of perfect marks and a room full of changed perspectives, the realization settled in fully. Respect does not arrive when you demand it. It arrives when it can no longer be denied. And in that moment, every person in that range understood that they had not just witnessed skill, they had witnessed something far rarer. Quiet mastery that never needed to announce itself. Emily did not rush as she gathered her things, each movement quiet, deliberate, as if the moment that had just unfolded required no celebration, no acknowledgement, only completion. The soft sound of her case closing seemed louder now in the lingering silence, a subtle punctuation mark at the end of something none of them had expected to witness. Behind her, the men remained where they stood, no longer grouped by confidence or ego, but by a shared realization that had settled in without permission. The man who had first mocked her shifted his weight slightly, as if unsure whether to speak again, his earlier certainty replaced by something unfamiliar, restraint. "Wait," he said finally, the word coming out slower than intended, careful, almost hesitant. Emily paused, not turning immediately, not reacting with curiosity or impatience, just pausing, giving the moment space. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them with a different kind of awareness now. "You did not miss once," he continued, his voice steady but lower. "No longer meant for performance. That does not just happen." Emily turned slightly, her expression calm, her eyes steady, not defensive, not proud, just present. "No," she said simply, and that single word carried more weight than any explanation could have, because it confirmed what they had all begun to understand but had not yet said out loud. The older shooter folded his arms again, but this time it was not a posture of authority, it was one of thought. 25 yards, consistent grouping, controlled breathing. He murmured, almost to himself, analyzing what he had seen, not to challenge it, but to accept it. "That takes years," another added quietly, the tone no longer competitive, but respectful. Emily adjusted the strap of her bag over her shoulder, her movements unchanged, grounded, as if the shift in the room had not altered her in the slightest, because it had not. She had walked in the same way. She was now preparing to leave, unaffected by how others chose to see her. The younger shooter who had been watching closely stepped forward, his voice softer than before. "Why did you not say anything?" he asked, not accusing, just genuinely curious. Emily met his gaze briefly, and for the first time there was the faintest hint of something in her expression, not emotion exactly, but understanding. "About what?" she replied, and the question itself answered his, because to her, there had been nothing to prove, nothing to defend. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, it was reflective, the kind that forces people to sit with what they have just learned. The man who had offered the challenge earlier glanced toward the target again, then back at her, shaking his head slightly. "We thought you were." He stopped himself, the rest of the sentence unnecessary. Emily gave a small nod, not agreeing, not correcting, just acknowledging that she understood what he meant. And in that simple exchange, something shifted one last time, not in her, but in them, because respect, real respect, does not come from being told who someone is. It comes from realizing who they are after you have already made up your mind about them. Emily turned fully now, heading toward the exit, her footsteps quiet against the polished floor, each step carrying her further from the moment that had changed everything for everyone else, but nothing for her. The door opened with the same soft creak as before, the late afternoon light still stretching across the space, unchanged, indifferent to what had just happened inside. And as she stepped through, one of the men glanced toward the sign-in sheet near the counter, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the names, then stopping suddenly, his posture stiffening just slightly. "Wait," he said under his breath, reading it again more carefully this time. The name was simple, easy to miss, but now it carried a weight none of them had noticed before. And as the realization began to form, slow but undeniable, he looked back toward the door she had just walked through, the room falling silent once more, Because sometimes the biggest revelation does not happen in the moment of action. It happens after, when the truth finally catches up to what you have already seen. And in that quiet, no one spoke, because they all understood at the same time. They had not just witnessed skill, they had overlooked a story far bigger than they had ever imagined. The silence did not break even after the door closed behind her. It lingered, heavier now, as if the room itself was still catching up to what had just happened. The man standing near the sign in sheets stared at the name again, his eyes narrowing, then widening slightly as recognition finally settled in. Slow but undeniable. Emily Carter, he repeated under his breath. And this time the name did not feel ordinary. It carried something else. Something that connected to a memory just out of reach. The older shooter turned toward him, noticing the shift in his expression. "What is it?" he asked, his tone low but sharp. The man hesitated for a fraction of a second, then looked back up, his voice quieter now, almost cautious. "I think I have seen that name before." A few of the others stepped closer, drawn not by curiosity this time, but by the sense that something important was unfolding just beyond their understanding. "Where?" the younger shooter asked, his earlier uncertainty now replaced by a focused intensity. The man shook his head slightly, as if trying to pull the memory into clarity. "Competition records, maybe, or an article." He paused, then added, "Something about precision shooting, years ago." The room shifted. Again, not physically, but mentally, as pieces began to rearrange themselves in ways that made their earlier behavior feel smaller, narrower. The older man's expression changed subtly, his earlier analysis now sharpening into something more defined. "National level," he said slowly, testing the idea as he spoke it, the words landing heavier than expected, because if that was true, then everything they had just witnessed was not surprising. It was inevitable. The younger shooter pulled out his phone again, but this time not to record, his fingers moving quickly across the screen, searching, scrolling, the faint glow reflecting in his eyes as the silence stretched once more. No one interrupted him. No one spoke, because they all felt it now, that quiet realization building beneath the surface. And then he stopped, his hand freezing mid-motion, his eyes fixed on the screen. "I found something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The others leaned in slightly, not crowding, but drawn closer by the weight of the moment. He turned the phone toward them, and there it was, a photo, older, slightly dated, but unmistakable. The same calm expression, the same steady gaze, but standing on a podium, holding a medal, the caption beneath it clear and simple, "A National Precision Shooting Championship." Her name printed beneath it, Emily Carter. The room did not react immediately, no gasps, no sudden exclamations, just a slow, collective stillness as the truth settled fully into place. One of the men exhaled quietly, shaking his head, not in disbelief anymore, but in understanding. "We laughed at her," he said softly, the words not accusatory, just factual. The man who had first mocked her looked down briefly, his jaw tightening slightly, not out of anger, but out of recognition of his own mistake, his own certainty that had now been completely undone. The older shooter glanced once more toward the door she had exited through, then back at the image on the phone. "She did not come here to prove anything," he said, more to himself than anyone else. She already had. And that realization carried more weight than anything else they had uncovered, because it meant that everything they had seen was not a performance, not a response to their behavior. It was simply who she was, unchanged by their presence, unaffected by their assumptions. The younger shooter lowered his phone slowly, his earlier curiosity now replaced by something quieter, more grounded. Respect that had arrived too late to change what had already happened, but not too late to matter. The room remained still, but it was no longer the same silence from before. It was different now, heavier with understanding, lighter without arrogance. And as they stood there, each one replaying the moment in their own mind, one truth became clear in a way that could not be ignored. They had not just misjudged her. They had revealed something about themselves, something they could not take back. And in that quiet, no one spoke, because there was nothing left to say that would make it any different. No one moved for a long moment after the realization settled, not because they did not know what to do, but because they suddenly understood that anything they did now would feel smaller than what had already happened. The energy in the room had shifted completely. Where there had once been casual arrogance, there was now a quiet weight, the kind that forces reflection whether you want it or not. The man who had first mocked her exhaled slowly, running a hand across the back of his neck as if trying to shake off something that would not leave. "We did not even see it," he said, his voice low, almost to himself. But everyone heard it, because they were all thinking the same thing. The older shooter nodded slightly, his gaze still fixed on the image on the phone, then drifting back toward the empty doorway. "No," he replied. "We saw what we expected to see." And that distinction hung in the air, heavier than any earlier joke, because it meant the mistake had not been hers. It had been theirs from the very beginning. The younger shooter looked down at his phone again, scrolling through more images, more records, each one quietly confirming what they had already begun to accept: years of competition, awards, recognition, none of which had been visible when she walked in wearing a simple hoodie and worn sneakers. None of which had mattered to her in that moment, and that was what unsettled them most. Not just that she was skilled, but that she had never needed them to know it. The man who had offered her the higher caliber rounds leaned against the divider now, his posture no longer casual but thoughtful. "She let us talk," he said slowly. She heard everything, and still said nothing. There was no accusation in his voice, only realization, because silence like that is not weakness, it is control. The older shooter glanced at him briefly, then back toward the lane she had used, the target still hanging in place, marked by perfect precision. "That is the difference," he said. "We talk to prove something. She does not have to." The group fell quiet again, but this time it was not uncomfortable. It was necessary, each of them replaying their own words, their own expressions, their own assumptions, and seeing them now from a different perspective, one that made those moments feel smaller, narrower, almost careless. The younger shooter slipped his phone back into his pocket, his shoulders lowering slightly, the tension replaced by something steadier. "Do you think she will come back?" he asked, not with excitement, but with a kind of quiet hope. The older man considered the question for a moment, then shook his head slightly. "People like that do not come back for approval," he said, his tone calm, certain. "They come when they want to, and they leave when they are done." And that answer settled over them with a clarity that no one challenged, because it fit everything they had just witnessed. The man near the sign-in sheet looked down at the name one more time, then closed the book gently, as if acknowledging something final, something that did not need to be revisited to be understood. Around them, the range slowly returned to its normal rhythm, distant sounds creeping back in, conversations resuming in quieter tones. But for those who had been standing there, nothing felt quite the same, because once you see something clearly, you cannot unsee it. And once you realize how quickly you judged someone, you cannot pretend you did not. The man who had first spoken against her looked toward the empty lane where she had stood, his expression no longer guarded, no longer confident, just thoughtful. "Next time," he said quietly, though he did not finish the sentence, because he did not need to. The meaning was already there, and in that unfinished thought, something had already changed, not in her story, but in theirs, because sometimes the most important lesson is not the one that is taught out loud. It is the one you are left to sit with long after the moment has passed. And in that quiet understanding, the room moved forward, but not unchanged, not the same as before, and not likely to forget what had just happened anytime soon. The range never fully returned to what it had been before, not for them. Not after that afternoon had quietly rewritten something they had carried for years without questioning. The conversations resumed, the sounds returned. But underneath it all there was a new awareness, subtle but permanent. The man who had first mocked her stood alone for a moment near lane 7, his eyes drifting once more toward the empty space she had occupied, as if expecting her to still be there, as if part of him had not quite accepted that she had come and gone without needing anything from any of them. He let out a slow breath, his shoulders lowering, not in defeat, but in acceptance, because some lessons do not arrive loudly. They arrive quietly, and they stay. The older shooter approached him, not with criticism, not with judgment, but with a calm understanding that only comes from experience. "You will remember this one," he said, his voice steady. The man nodded slightly. "I already do," he replied, and there was no humor left in his tone, only reflection. Across the room, The younger shooter stood near the target one last time, looking at the perfect grouping, not with disbelief anymore, but with a kind of respect that had settled in. Slowly, he raised his hand again, but this time he did not touch it. He simply looked, as if acknowledging that what had happened there was not something to question, but something to learn from. He stepped back, turning toward the others, his posture different now, more grounded, less certain in the way it had been before, and that difference was enough, because change does not always announce itself. Sometimes it is only visible in what people choose not to say next time. The sign and book rested quietly on the counter, her name still there, unchanged, but now it meant something entirely different to everyone who had seen it. Not just a name, but a reminder, a quiet line inked onto a page that had exposed something. Deeper than skill, it had revealed assumption, and more importantly, it had corrected it. The man near the counter closed the book again gently, not out of habit, but out of respect, as if closing a chapter that had already done its work. The late afternoon light had shifted slightly, stretching longer across the floor, casting softer shadows. And in that calm, the range felt different, not because anything had physically changed, but because the people inside it had, even if only a little, even if only in ways they would fully understand later. The older shooter glanced once more toward the entrance, then back at the group. Next time someone walks in, he said quietly, maybe we look a little longer before we decide who they are. No one disagreed, because they had already learned what happens when you do not. And as the room settled into its new rhythm, the memory of that moment stayed with them, not as a story to tell, but as a standard to carry forward, because respect is not something you give when it is convenient. It is something you learn to give before you know who deserves it, and that lesson, once learned, does not fade easily. It becomes part of how you see the world, part of how you choose your words, part of how you hold your judgment just a little longer than before. And somewhere beyond the walls of that range, Emily Carter continued her day exactly as she always had, unchanged by what had happened, unaware of the shift she had left behind. Because the truth is, people like her do not walk into rooms to change them. They simply walk in as they are, and the room changes on its own. Respect is always revealed when you least expect it. If you believe in stories that uncover truth and dignity, hit like and subscribe because the next story might change the way you see the world. Thank you for watching.